My name is Alula Rose. I'm in my early 30s, and for most of my professional life, I've been described with words like steady, pleasant, and reliable. Not brilliant, not formidable, not dangerous, just reliable. I've always had a soft voice. I pause before I speak. I don't interrupt. I don't perform confidence the way people expect. In corporate meetings, that often translates into something very specific. People assume I'm agreeable, easy, uncomplicated. And if you've ever been the quiet woman in the room, you already know how that story tends to go. This is not a revenge story. It's not dramatic in the way television would want it to be. There are no screaming matches, no slammed doors, no cinematic monologues. What happened instead was slower, quieter, almost invisible until it wasn't. For years, I worked under a manager who publicly praised transparency and team trust. I believed him. Most of us did. He had the kind of confidence that fills a room without raising his voice. And I had the kind that doesn't. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that my private calls were being recorded, archived, edited. The clips he later presented weren't whole conversations. They were fragments, rearranged, context removed, tone implied. The edited clips he used were exposed as manipulated. But that exposure didn't happen overnight. And it didn't happen because I fought loudly. It happened because I chose stillness. This story is about what it feels like to be underestimated in slow motion, about what it costs to realize someone has been shaping a narrative about you behind closed doors, and about the moment you decide you will no longer defend yourself with emotion, only with facts. There is a particular kind of betrayal that doesn't shatter you, it clarifies you. I'm going to walk you through how I discovered the recordings, how I subpoenaed the full audio archive, and what changed, both legally and internally, once the full truth surfaced. But more than that, I want to talk about quiet dominance, the kind that doesn't need applause, the kind that doesn't humiliate anyone, the kind that simply reveals reality. If you've ever felt dismissed in a room that underestimated you, if you've ever sensed something was wrong but couldn't prove it yet, have you ever wondered what would happen if you stopped arguing and simply started documenting? To my manager, I was dependable. He said it often enough that it almost sounded like a compliment. Alula will handle it. Alula's detail oriented. Alula doesn't get emotional. The room would nod, smiles, moving on. Dependable is the word you use for someone who absorbs extra work without resistance. It's the word you use for someone who doesn't argue in meetings. It's the word you use for someone who won't embarrass you. I worked as a compliance analyst for a mid-sized financial consultancy in Seattle. My role was technical, procedural, invisible, unless something went wrong. I built internal reporting structures, audited documentation trails, and ensured our communications aligned with regulatory frameworks. It wasn't glamorous, but it required precision. Precision is quite work. In meetings, I spoke when I had something verifiable to add. I rarely speculated. I never interrupted. I didn't need to dominate the conversation to feel valuable. My confidence lived in preparation. But here's what I learned. In environments driven by performance and optics, quiet preparation reads as passivity. My manager, I'll call him Daniel, had a very different presence, charismatic, relaxed posture, the kind of man who leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers while other people spoke. He liked framing ideas. reframing them, taking something someone else said and polishing it into something that sounded like his own strategic insight. I noticed. I didn't comment. When he assigned me projects, he would say things like, I trust you with this. You're low maintenance. Low maintenance. It's fascinating how praise can contain its own hierarchy. To them, I was a stable infrastructure, not leadership material, not someone who needed protecting, certainly not someone who needed transparency. When calls were scheduled between Daniel and clients, I was often looped in to observe or take notes. I would sit quietly, camera on, mic muted, unless prompted. Afterward, I would summarize key action items and circulate them. My summaries were thorough, neutral, accurate. Sometimes, I noticed small discrepancies between what was promised in the call and what Daniel later claimed had been said. Nothing dramatic, just tonal shifts, emphasis changes, subtle repositioning. At first, I assumed it was an interpretation. There's a particular social choreography in corporate environments. The louder narrative tends to override the precise one. And because I didn't fight for narrative control, I wasn't seen as someone who would. Over time, I became the person people vented to in private, but rarely defended in public. Colleagues would say, You're too nice, or You should speak up more. But here's what they didn't understand: silence isn't always surrender, sometimes it's observation. I watched how Daniel managed perception, how he controlled meeting recaps, how he framed conflicts as misunderstandings, how he subtly positioned himself as the stabilizer when tensions rose. And because I didn't react emotionally, he assumed I wasn't analyzing. There's a specific way people underestimate calm women. They mistake composure for naivety. They assume that because you don't display threat, you don't contain it. In team reviews, my performance was consistently rated strong contributor, never strategic, never executive potential, just steady. I remember one annual evaluation where Daniel smiled and said, You're not political. That's refreshing. He meant it kindly, but what he meant was, You're not competing with me. At least, that's what he believed. I wasn't trying to compete. I was trying to understand. And at that point, I still thought understanding would be enough. It wasn't. The first time something felt wrong, it was small enough to dismiss. That's how these things begin. It was a Tuesday client call, routine quarterly review. I had prepared a compliance variance report the night before, triple checked every figure, and cross referenced the attachments. Daniel skimmed it that morning and said, Perfect, I'll frame this. Frame this. On the call, he presented the data confidently. He referenced my report. Alula pulled the numbers and then shifted into interpretation. He explained a discrepancy in one account as a temporary reporting lag. That wasn't what my report concluded. I had written. Discrepancy indicates documentation delay requiring internal review. Not catastrophic, not accusatory, but not a harmless lag either. When the client asked if there was any compliance risk, Daniel answered smoothly, No immediate concern. I felt the pause in my chest, not fear, not panic, just awareness. After the call, I followed up via email, politely. I reiterated that the documentation delay should be formally logged and internally reviewed, as discussed. I included the relevant regulatory citation. Daniel replied privately, not copying the client. Let's not overcomplicate this, he wrote. We don't need to escalate everything. Escalate everything. I reread my own email 3 times. It was neutral, clinical, professional. There was no escalation in tone, only accuracy. That was the first small cut. It wasn't the disagreement. Professionals disagree all the time. It was the subtle reframing of my diligence as overreaction. Later that week, during a team sync, Daniel mentioned, lightly, that sometimes compliance can be overly cautious. He didn't say my name. He didn't need to. A few colleagues glanced at me briefly. Not accusatory, just registering context. And I smiled. Because what else do you do in a moment like that? You tell yourself, he's managing optics. You tell yourself, this is normal corporate smoothing. You tell yourself, don't be sensitive. But something lodged under my skin. I began noticing patterns. In meetings, if I flagged a potential risk, Daniel would say, let's not assume worst case scenarios. If a more outspoken colleague raised a concern, he'd respond, that's a good strategic catch. Same function, different framing. I didn't confront him. Part of me still believed this was about communication styles. That if I adjusted my tone, softened phrasing, added more qualifiers, it would align better. So I did. Instead of writing requires review, I wrote may benefit from review. Instead of compliance risk, I wrote potential area to monitor. The substance remained, the language is diluted. And strangely, that's when he began complimenting me more. See, this is balanced, he'd say. Balanced. I started saving copies of my original drafts before edits. Not because I suspected anything severe, just because I wanted to track how often my conclusions were being softened. It was an unconscious instinct at first, a digital breadcrumb trail. Still, I rationalized everything. Daniel wasn't hostile. He wasn't overtly dismissive. He wasn't cruel. He was smooth, and smooth can be harder to challenge than sharp. The first small cut didn't bleed. It barely marked the skin. But it taught me something important. When your clarity is repeatedly reframed as overreaction, you begin questioning your own calibration. And once you start questioning your calibration, someone else quietly controls the dial. I didn't know yet how important that realization would become. I only knew that something in me had started paying closer attention. The second time it happened, I didn't even flinch. That's how normalization works. It doesn't arrive with force. It arrives with repetition. A month after the compliance discrepancy incident, Daniel scheduled a series of internal strategy calls. These weren't client-facing. They were positioning calls, shaping how we would present certain performance metrics in the next quarter. He invited me to all of them, not to lead, not to present, to listen in. On one of those calls, I flagged, gently, that a particular metric could be interpreted as misleading if shown without context. I explained the nuance. I even offered alternative wording that would remain accurate while preserving confidence. There was a pause. Then Daniel chuckled lightly. You always find the cautious angle, Alula. A few people laughed, not at me, but with the room. He continued, that's why we have you, to keep us honest. It sounded like praise, but the subtext was clear. You are here to worry. We are here to decide. The conversation moved on without addressing my suggestion. After the call, one colleague messaged me privately. You were right, though. I responded with a thumbs up emoji. That was becoming my language. Neutral, contained, undemanding. Over time, small adjustments accumulated. If I proposed something in a meeting, it would often be acknowledged but not discussed. Then, 15 minutes later, someone else would rephrase the same idea, and Daniel would engage with it enthusiastically. At first, I assumed coincidence, then pattern. The human mind is remarkably good at protecting itself from uncomfortable truths. I told myself I wasn't being overlooked. I was just not assertive enough in delivery. So I tried something new. In one meeting, instead of prefacing my comment with qualifiers, I stated it cleanly. This approach could create regulatory exposure if documented externally. No apology, no softening. Daniel's response was immediate. Let's not use dramatic language. Dramatic. The word settled heavily. It wasn't dramatic, it was accurate. But by labeling it dramatic, he repositioned me as emotionally exaggerated rather than technically precise. And here's the part that's difficult to admit. I started moderating myself preemptively. Before speaking, I would run a mental filter. Is this too strong, too cautious, too inconvenient? I began trimming my sentences before anyone else could. That's what normalization does. It teaches you to self censor so no one else has to. What I didn't recognize yet was how strategically useful that dynamic was for Daniel. If I softened myself voluntarily, he didn't need to overtly silence me. If I doubted my calibration, he became the calibrator. There was no shouting, no humiliation, no overt hostility, just a consistent pattern of reframing. And because it was subtle, I hesitated to name it. In performance reviews, he continued describing me as steady, supportive, and detail oriented. Never strategic, never visionary, never leadership. When a junior team member was promoted ahead of me, someone I had quietly trained, Daniel explained that they had stronger executive presence. Executive presence. I went home that evening and sat at my kitchen table longer than usual. Not crying, not angry, just thinking. Had I mistaken invisibility for humility? Had I equated calmness with safety? I realized something uncomfortable. I had been complicit in my own minimization. Not because I lacked capability, but because I believed integrity would speak for itself. But integrity without narrative protection is vulnerable. And the narrative in our office belonged to Daniel, at least for now. What I didn't yet know was that the very quality he underestimated, my tendency to document, archive, and track patterns, would soon become something far more consequential. Normalization had trained me to observe quietly, and observation, when disciplined, becomes leverage. I just hadn't realized what I would eventually need it for. There's a moment in every long term dynamic when you finally see the role you've been cast in, not the job description, the psychological assignment. For me, that moment came during a quarterly leadership offsite. It was one of those polished events, rented conference space, catered lunch, whiteboards covered in strategic ambitions. I wasn't technically part of leadership, but Daniel insisted I attend for a compliance perspective. I sat near the end of the table, notebook open, pen aligned neatly along the margin. It wasn't insecurity, it was a habit. As discussions unfolded, I noticed something almost theatrical in its predictability. When someone proposed an ambitious initiative, Daniel would glance at me and say, Alula, any compliance red flags? The room would turn toward me. I would answer carefully, outlining potential regulatory implications. I never shut ideas down. I outlined parameters, and without fail, after I spoke, Daniel would lean forward and reframe. See? Manageable. We just need guardrails. He positioned himself as the translator between my caution and their ambition. I wasn't the strategist. I was the brake pedal, reliable, necessary, but never driving. At lunch, one of the directors joked, we can't do anything fun without Alula signing off first. Everyone laughed. I smiled too, because on the surface, it was harmless. But internally, something shifted. I realized I had become a prop in someone else's narrative architecture, the responsible one, the safe one, the internal conscience that never threatened the throne. It's a subtle power structure. If you assign someone the role of guardian, you ensure they never become ruler. Later that afternoon, as the team discussed future promotions, Daniel spoke confidently about visibility and leadership branding. He emphasized the importance of being externally persuasive. He never once mentioned analytical rigor, not because it wasn't important, because it didn't enhance his narrative. I understood then that my invisibility wasn't accidental, it was functional. By keeping me in the role of quiet validator, he retained interpretive control. I provided credibility, he provided charisma, and I had accepted that division without protest. On the drive home, I replayed small moments from the past year. How often had I been asked to sanity check presentations that bore someone else's name? How often had my language been softened to fit a tone that felt less precise than reality? How often had I allowed my neutrality to be mistaken for passivity? The answer was uncomfortable. I wasn't overlooked because I lacked skill. I was overlooked because I didn't claim narrative space. And Daniel, consciously or not, relied on that. There's something powerful about recognizing your assigned role, not to rebel impulsively, not to confront theatrically, just to see it clearly. Because once you see the role, you can decide whether to keep playing it. I didn't feel anger, I felt clarity. If I were being cast as the quiet guardian, then I would embody it fully. But the Guardian's document, Guardian's archive, Guardians remember exactly what was said. And for the first time, my documentation stopped being routine compliance practice and started becoming something more deliberate. I still attended calls. I still took notes. I still smiled when the room laughed. Outwardly, nothing changed. But internally, I had stopped assuming fairness was automatic, and that small internal shift would soon matter more than I could have predicted. The day everything shifted didn't look dramatic. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no public humiliation. It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. Daniel scheduled a quick sync with HR and me. The invite was vague, alignment discussion. That's corporate language for something you're not supposed to worry about, but instinctively do. When I joined the call, Daniel's camera was already on. HR was off. He smiled in that reassuring way he used when he wanted to preempt discomfort. We've received some feedback, he began, steepling his fingers. There are concerns about how certain communications have been perceived. Perceived, HR added gently. Some clients felt your tone in follow-up calls was firm, firm. I sat very still. I asked calmly, could you clarify which calls? Daniel glanced down briefly, then back up. We've reviewed some recordings. Recordings. The word landed differently. I hadn't been informed that internal calls were being recorded beyond the standard automated system notice, the one that applies to client-facing lines for compliance storage. But this wasn't a client complaint about documentation. This was about my tone. HR continued. In one instance, it sounded as though you contradicted leadership direction. Sounded as though I felt something unfamiliar then. Not panic, not anger, but precision sharpening. Do you have the full transcript? I asked. Daniel responded quickly. We don't need to get technical. It's about alignment. Alignment. He paraphrased part of a sentence I supposedly said. The phrasing didn't sound like mine. It was close, but slightly skewed. Missing qualifiers I almost always use. I know my language patterns. Precision isn't just a skill, it's muscle memory. I'd like to review the recording, I said evenly. Daniel paused. Barely perceptible, but there. It's not necessary, he replied. We're just coaching here. Coaching. There it was. The shift. Up until that moment, I had believed the dynamic was about narrative control in meetings, about perception management, about hierarchy. But this was different. If recordings were being selectively referenced to shape an internal assessment of my professionalism, without transparency, without full context, that wasn't just narrative framing. That was curation, and curation implies editing. The call ended with a vague recommendation: be mindful of tone. I thanked them for the feedback. Then I sat alone in my apartment, laptop still open, the quiet hum of my refrigerator the only sound in the room. I replayed recent calls in my head. I remembered one specifically. A client pressing about documentation discrepancies. I had said carefully, to remain compliant, we need written confirmation before proceeding. Not accusatory, not confrontational, procedural. But I could imagine how, clipped mid sentence, it might sound inflexible. That's when the internal shift crystallized. This wasn't about whether I was too firm, it was about who controlled the archive. If Daniel had access to call recordings, and if excerpts could be presented without full context, then the narrative about my professionalism could be shaped at will. And I would never even know. For the first time, silence didn't feel like observation. It felt like vulnerability. I opened my email and searched for our company's recording retention policy. Buried in the compliance handbook was a clause. All recorded communications are stored in centralized secure servers accessible to authorized managerial personnel. Authorized managerial personnel, which included Daniel. I closed the document slowly. The shift wasn't explosive. It was quiet. I understood something with absolute clarity. If context can be edited, truth becomes negotiable. And I had spent a year assuming truth would protect itself. It doesn't, not without access. That night, I didn't send any emails. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't confide in colleagues. I did something much simpler. I started making a list. Every call I could remember, where my phrasing had been later reinterpreted. Every meeting where my conclusions had been softened. Every instance of alignment feedback is without documentation. I wasn't angry. I was recalibrating. Because once you realize someone might be editing your voice, the only rational response isn't outrage. It's a strategy. After the HR call, something subtle changed in the way I moved through the office. Outwardly, I remained the same. I attended meetings. I submitted reports. I responded promptly to emails. If anything, I became even calmer. But internally, silence stopped being a reflex. It became a decision. There's a difference. Before, I stayed quiet because I assumed clarity would eventually surface on its own. I believed accuracy had a kind of moral gravity, that if something was distorted, it would naturally correct itself over time. Now I understand something more clinical. Accuracy without control of the record is fragile. So I stopped trying to win rooms. Instead, I started mapping systems. I reviewed the company's data retention policies in detail. Not just the surface level handbook, the full internal documentation accessible through our compliance portal. I learned which platforms auto recorded, which required manual activation, who had administrative privileges, how long were archives stored before deletion. I didn't ask questions out loud. I read. And I noticed something interesting. Client calls were automatically archived for regulatory compliance. Internal strategy calls, however, were recorded at managerial discretion. There was no clear policy requiring full contextual review before excerpts were used in performance evaluations. In other words, interpretation was centralized. and Daniel sat at that center. In meetings, I became almost observationally quiet, not withdrawn, not passive, just restrained. When Daniel reframed my statements, I no longer attempted to correct him in real time. I would nod, take notes, and follow up with written summaries after the call. Precise, time stamped, neutral. Per our discussion at 14:32, we agreed that written confirmation is required before proceeding. No emotion, no accusation, just documentation. At first, he didn't seem to notice. Then he did. One afternoon, he messaged me, "You don't have to document every nuance. It can feel defensive." Defensive. That word again. Subtle repositioning. I responded simply, "I find clarity reduces confusion later." He reacted with a thumbs up emoji. But the next week, he stopped looping me into certain internal calls. That was the first tangible shift in consequence. Colleagues mentioned meetings I hadn't been invited to. Strategy discussions that previously would have required compliance oversight were happening without me. It could have felt like exclusion. Instead, it felt like confirmation. If transparency becomes uncomfortable, people restrict access. Silence had become strategic because I no longer needed to argue my perspective in real time. I needed something more durable than verbal correction. I began keeping a personal log, not on company servers, not on shared drives, but privately. Dates, call durations, attendees, summary of discussions as I remembered them. Not interpretations, facts. And something inside me grew steadier with each entry. There's a particular power in disciplined quiet. It unnerves people who expect a reaction. Daniel, accustomed to gentle pushback or softened phrasing, now encountered something different. No resistance, but no delusion either. When he labeled something as dramatic, I simply asked, "Could you specify which part felt disproportionate?" Calm, direct. He would pivot quickly, changing tone. Without confrontation, without accusation, I had shifted from participant to observer. And observers are harder to manipulate because they are tracking patterns, not moments. Weeks passed like this. No explosions, no dramatic scenes, just a subtle recalibration of power, invisible to most of the team. What Daniel didn't realize was that my silence was no longer about politeness. It was about timing, because if recordings were being referenced selectively, and if internal narratives were being shaped quietly, then eventually, the only meaningful question would be, what exists in the full archive? And when that question was finally asked, I intended to be ready. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. From Daniel's perspective, I had become even more compliant, fewer objections, shorter responses, less visible resistance. To him, it probably felt like coaching had worked. To me, it felt like narrowing focus. I started by doing something simple. I requested copies of my own performance documentation under the company's internal transparency policy. Nothing aggressive, just routine record keeping. HR provided evaluation summaries, feedback notes, and written coaching recommendations. I read them carefully. The language pattern was consistent. Perceived tone, communication style concerns, needs alignment with leadership messaging. No direct citations, no transcripts, no full context, just impressions. That absence mattered. If my professionalism was being evaluated based on recorded calls, where were the complete transcripts? Where were the timestamps? Where was the documented standard for interpretation? They didn't exist in the file. At the same time, I began educating myself outside of work hours, not emotionally, structurally. I reviewed state-level recording consent laws. Washington is a two-party consent state for certain private recordings, but corporate compliance recordings fall into different regulatory categories when properly disclosed. The nuance mattered. I researched employment law precedent around selective evidence usage in performance reviews. I learned about discovery procedures, about subpoena authority in civil disputes, about data retention obligations once litigation is reasonably anticipated. I wasn't planning a lawsuit. I was understanding architecture. Knowledge changes posture. Even when you say nothing. At work, I made another quiet adjustment. I began confirming in writing when calls were being recorded. At the start of one internal meeting, I asked casually, just confirming, is this session being recorded? Daniel responded smoothly, standard compliance lines only. I followed up via email afterward. For my records, could you confirm whether the 3 p.m. strategy call was recorded? His reply was brief, no formal archive. Interesting, because HR had referenced reviewing recordings. So which calls had been archived? Under what classification? I continued documenting. Then something subtle but significant happened. A colleague I trusted, not emotionally but professionally, mentioned that Daniel had played short audio excerpts during a closed door leadership review. They weren't full calls, just clipped segments to illustrate communication tone, my voice, out of context, presented as evidence. I didn't react outwardly when she told me. I thanked her for the information and changed the subject. Internally, everything aligned. The recordings weren't hypothetical. They were curated. And curated means edited. That evening, I went back through my private log. I cross-referenced dates with calendar invites. I identified which calls might have contained the phrases Daniel paraphrased during the HR meeting. Then I noticed something else. Several of those calls involved regulatory disagreements, moments where I had insisted on written confirmation before proceeding, moments where my caution may have complicated quick approvals. If clipped mid-sentence, my insistence could sound rigid, but in full context, it was a procedural necessity. Context is everything, and context lives in full archives, not excerpts. For the first time, I allowed myself to think beyond internal HR processes. If recorded communications were being selectively used to shape my professional standing, then the integrity of that archive mattered, not emotionally, legally. There's a specific threshold in employment disputes called anticipation of litigation. Once crossed, companies are obligated to preserve relevant evidence. Deleting or altering archived material after that point becomes problematic. I wasn't threatening anyone, I wasn't accusing, but I began preparing for that threshold. I consulted discreetly with an employment attorney, not to file anything, but to ask questions hypothetically. What if recorded communications were selectively presented without full disclosure? I asked. The attorney's response was calm. Then you would request the full archive in discovery. Full archive, not clips, not summaries, not paraphrased impressions. Every minute, every timestamp, every unedited file. The idea settled over me, not like revenge, but like equilibrium. Daniel believed he controlled the narrative because he controlled excerpts. He never considered that excerpts are vulnerable once the whole exists. At work, I remained unchanged, steady, polite, efficient. But beneath that steadiness, I was positioning quietly, because the difference between suspicion and leverage is documentation. And by then, I had both. The turning point didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in a small, quiet office with neutral carpeting and a glass of water I didn't touch. I scheduled a second meeting with the employment attorney, this time with specifics, not accusations, not outrage, facts. I brought my private log, printed emails, performance reviews, HR's phrasing about reviewed recordings, calendar invites that aligned with those references. My follow up emails confirmed whether sessions were recorded and Daniel's brief responses. The attorney listened without interruption. Then she asked one question that reframed everything. Has anyone provided you with full copies of the recordings used to evaluate you? No, I said. Have they documented how excerpts were selected? No, she nodded once, calm. If recordings were used in a performance process, you are entitled to request the materials relied upon. And if they refuse, that becomes relevant. Relevant, not dramatic, not explosive. Procedural, that word felt steady. I wasn't seeking public confrontation. I wasn't interested in humiliation. I wanted something simpler, the complete record. Because if the clips Daniel played were accurate representations, the full archive would confirm that. And if they weren't, the attorney explained how formal requests work, how preservation notices function, how a subpoena can compel production of archived digital material if litigation proceeds. She didn't promise outcomes. She outlined mechanisms, and mechanisms are predictable. For the first time since the HR call, I felt something close to relief. Not because I had leverage, but because uncertainty had structure. The edited clips he used were exposed as manipulated, not publicly, not yet. But when the attorney reviewed the paraphrased phrases in my evaluation and compared them to the email summaries I had sent after those calls, the inconsistencies were obvious. If my follow-up summaries reflected full context, and if those summaries had been circulated without objection at the time, then selectively clipped audio that altered tone could be challenged, especially if edits omitted qualifying language. The attorney leaned back slightly. If the archive exists in full, it will either protect them or protect you. There it was again, full archive. Until that moment, my documentation had felt defensive, like building a shield. Now it felt architectural. If I initiated a formal legal inquiry, the company would be obligated to preserve all relevant communications, including raw audio files, including metadata timestamps, including edit logs if they existed. You cannot selectively curate evidence once discovery begins. That is not revenge. That is the process. I went home that evening and sat in silence for a long time. This was the irreversible threshold. Once I sent a formal request for full audio archives, the dynamic would shift permanently. Even if no lawsuit ever reached court, the internal implications would be significant. Daniel would know, HR would know, the company's legal department would know. I asked myself a quiet question. Was I prepared for that shift? Not emotionally, strategically, because this wasn't about proving I was right. It was about protecting the integrity of recorded truth. I reviewed my notes again. I listened to my own memory of those calls, not emotionally, but analytically. I remembered the pauses, the qualifiers, the context around the sentences Daniel paraphrased. If the archive confirmed that qualifiers were removed in the presented excerpts, then this was no longer about tone coaching. It was about manipulation, and manipulation, once documented, rarely remains contained. I slept calmly that night, not because I was certain of the outcome, but because, for the first time, I understood the structure clearly enough to act without emotion. The next step would not be loud, it would be procedural. And once initiated, it could not be undone. There are moments in life when you realize neutrality is no longer neutral. Up until this point, I had been observing, preparing, documenting, learning the architecture of systems that most people never need to understand. But preparation without action eventually becomes avoidance. I had three options. The first was to do nothing, continue working, adjust my tone further, accept the communication feedback as part of corporate politics, hope the pattern faded. That option would preserve comfort. It would also validate the precedent that curated excerpts were acceptable tools for evaluation. The second option was to escalate internally, file a formal complaint with HR, request transparency under company policy, ask for the full recordings used in my assessment. That path would be visible but contained, and it would still rely on the same internal structure that had already permitted selective presentation. The third option was irreversible. Through legal counsel, issue a formal preservation notice and request for the complete audio archive, not just the calls referenced in my evaluation, but all recorded communications involving me within the relevant period. If they refused or provided incomplete material, escalation would follow. The difference between the second and third options was subtle but critical. Internal complaints operate within the company's control. Formal legal requests shift control outside it. I didn't rush the decision. For several days, I moved through work as usual. I attended meetings. I submitted reports. I responded to Daniel with the same measured professionalism he was accustomed to. But internally, I was evaluating risk. Would this end my position at the company? Possibly. Would it change how leadership perceived me? Absolutely. Would it protect the integrity of my professional record if manipulation existed? Yes. And that was the axis, not ego, not anger. Record. If I allowed curated excerpts to define my professionalism, that narrative could follow me beyond this company. Performance reviews matter. Internal documentation matters. Silence at this stage would be consent. So I chose the third option, not impulsively, not emotionally, deliberately. My attorney drafted a formal letter requesting preservation of all audio recordings, metadata, and related documentation involving my communications during the specified time frame. The letter cited concern regarding selective excerpt usage in performance evaluation and requested access to the full, unedited archives. It was precise, clinical, non-accusatory. It did not threaten. It invoked a procedure. When I read the final draft before it was sent, I felt no surge of adrenaline, just steadiness. This was not a confrontation. It was in alignment with my own standard. The letter was delivered to the company's legal department on a Monday morning. Daniel had no idea when he logged into his inbox that day. Neither did I know exactly how he would respond. But I understood one thing clearly. Once a preservation notice is issued, deletion becomes dangerous. Once discovery is possible, editing becomes visible. Once full archives are requested, excerpts lose power. I closed my laptop that evening and stepped outside for a walk. The air felt the same. The city moved the same. Nothing outward had changed. But internally, something had settled into place. I was no longer observing from the margins. I had stepped into the process. Calmly, quietly, irreversibly. And now, the consequences would begin. The most powerful shifts are often invisible at first. The preservation notice was delivered on a Monday. By Tuesday afternoon, subtle tremors began. I wasn't copied on the initial internal response, but I didn't expect to be. Legal communications rarely include the subject of the inquiry. What I did notice was behavioral. Daniel cancelled our weekly one-on-one, no explanation. Just reschedule for next week. HR sent a neutral email requesting a clarification meeting regarding documentation processes. Clarification. Language always reveals pressure. I attended the meeting calmly. HR's tone was professional but careful. They asked whether I had concerns about how feedback had been communicated. I responded simply, I have concerns about reliance on partial recordings without full contextual review. No accusation, no escalation in voice, just clarity. They didn't argue, they took notes. Behind the scenes, I knew what was happening. Once a formal preservation notice is issued, companies are obligated to secure relevant data. IT departments are instructed to suspend routine deletion cycles. Backup servers are reviewed. Access logs are preserved. Metadata trails become relevant. It's procedural, it's quiet, and it leaves digital footprints. Daniel's demeanor shifted slightly over the next week. Still composed, still confident, but less casual in meetings. He no longer paraphrased my statements loosely. When I spoke, he let my phrasing stand. That change alone told me everything. If someone is confident in the archive, they don't adjust their behavior. If they aren't, they become precise. A few days later, I received formal acknowledgement from the company's legal department. They confirmed receipt of the preservation request and stated they were reviewing relevant materials. Relevant materials, not non existent materials, not miscommunication, materials. I continued performing my role exactly as before. I submitted reports, I attended calls, I documented summaries, still time-stamped, still neutral. Externally, I appeared unchanged. Internally, I felt anchored. There is something stabilizing about choosing action aligned with your values. Even if outcomes remain uncertain, the act itself removes self-doubt. Colleagues began sensing tension, though no one named it directly. Meetings felt slightly tighter, conversations shorter. Daniel was less performative, more measured. He stopped making jokes about overcautious compliance. Silence can alter the atmosphere without a single raised voice. Weeks passed. Then the first production arrived. Through counsel, I received access to a subset of audio files, the specific calls referenced in my performance evaluation. Not transcripts, raw audio. I didn't listen immediately. I waited until I was alone. Seated at my desk, headphones on, the first file loaded. I heard the automated recording notice. I heard the full exchange. I heard my sentence, the one paraphrased in HR in its complete form. And there it was, the qualifier, the context, the collaborative tone. In the excerpt described in my evaluation, the qualifying clause had been omitted. Not dramatically, not maliciously obvious, just clipped before the softening language. The firm tone sounded firm because the balancing phrasing was removed. I listened to the second file. Same pattern, a pause cut. A contextual explanation is omitted. A sentence ending before the collaborative framing. My chest didn't tighten. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt confirmed. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was curation. And once full archives are subject to review, curation becomes discoverable. I closed my laptop slowly. The next phase wouldn't be emotional. It would be consequential. Because now, it wasn't about perception. It was about record integrity. And records, once questioned, tend to unravel quietly, but thoroughly. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They accumulate. After reviewing the initial audio files, my attorney requested the complete archive, not just the calls cited in my evaluation, but all recordings involving my participation within the designated time frame. This is where systems either hold or fracture. The company's legal team responded with procedural caution. They acknowledged the broader request and indicated that retrieval would require additional time due to volume. Volume. That word carried weight. Volume meant the archive was extensive. Volume meant There were more files than initially disclosed. Volume meant this was no longer about two isolated excerpts. Internally, something shifted. Daniel's meetings became shorter, agendas tighter. He stopped referencing past calls casually. When recapping discussions, he read directly from notes instead of paraphrasing from memory. Colleagues noticed the change, even if they couldn't name its cause. One afternoon, a senior director pulled me aside after a meeting. "You seem calm," she said carefully. "I am," I replied. "It wasn't performance, it was true." Because once the archive is secured, narrative distortion loses oxygen. A week later, HR scheduled another conversation. This time, the tone was markedly different. They explained that during internal review of audio materials, inconsistencies were identified between summarized excerpts used in performance discussions and the full recordings. Inconsistencies. They didn't say manipulation. They didn't say editing. They didn't need to. I asked one question. Were the excerpts reviewed in full context before being presented? There was a pause. "We are still evaluating process gaps," HR responded. Process gaps. Language softens impact, but impact remains. The atmosphere in the office grew restrained. Daniel no longer met my eyes casually in meetings. When he did, it was brief, measured. He didn't confront me. He didn't accuse me of overreacting. He didn't attempt to coach my tone. He became administrative, procedural. Because once legal oversight enters a dynamic, improvisation becomes risky. The broader archive review continued. Through counsel, I learned that metadata analysis showed audio segments had been exported separately from full recordings before being shared internally. Exported separately, not accidental clipping, not a system glitch, manual selection. Still, I felt no desire for spectacle. This wasn't about public embarrassment. It was about restoration. Within weeks, my performance evaluation was formally placed under review. References to tone concerns were temporarily suspended pending reassessment. Colleagues didn't know the details. They only sensed recalibration. Projects I had previously been excluded from quietly reappeared in my calendar invites. Leadership began asking for my input more directly, not through Daniel. Loss reveals itself subtly. When someone's authority has relied on narrative control, transparency weakens that foundation. Daniel wasn't removed. He wasn't publicly reprimanded. But something intangible shifted. Trust. And trust, once questioned at the leadership level, rarely returns to its original form. The consequences weren't explosive. They were structural. And structures don't collapse loudly. They realign. I continued showing up exactly the same way I always had. Steady, precise, neutral. Because this was never about changing who I was. It was about ensuring that who I was could no longer be edited. By the time Daniel requested a private meeting, the review had already expanded beyond him. That's the thing about process. Once it begins, it doesn't stay contained. He closed the conference room door gently. No tension in his posture, no visible anger, just careful composure. "I think this has escalated further than necessary," he began. Escalated. I let the word sit in the air. "This could have been handled internally," he continued. "Now legal is involved. It complicates things." Complicates things. For whom? I didn't interrupt. Silence is clarifying when someone else fills it. Daniel leaned forward slightly. The excerpts were meant to illustrate tone patterns. They weren't intended to misrepresent you. Intended. There's a quiet distinction between intention and impact. I responded evenly. The full recordings show qualifiers were removed. He inhaled slowly. That wasn't malicious. I believed him. I truly did. Because manipulation doesn't always originate from cruelty. Sometimes It originates from convenience, from narrative management, from believing your interpretation is justified enough to shape evidence around it. But once the full archive is subject to review, justification loses insulation. This has created scrutiny, he said, softer now. It reflects on the department. There it was, not concerned about me, concern about optics. And yet, he wasn't hostile. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't threatening. He was recalculating. What he hadn't anticipated was that a preservation notice doesn't just secure audio files, it secures access logs, export histories, metadata timestamps. When segments are pulled from archives, systems record that activity. Digital systems don't forget context the way humans do. By that point, the company's legal team had begun reviewing not only the audio, but the process by which excerpts were selected and presented in performance discussions. HR reached out separately later that week. They informed me that the tone-related performance concerns were being formally withdrawn pending procedural review. They also mentioned that leadership training around evidence integrity was being considered. Evidence integrity. Language shifts when accountability becomes structural. Daniel's influence hadn't vanished overnight. He still held his title. He still ran meetings. But the confidence in his framing, the subtle authority that came from shaping narrative, had weakened. Colleagues began documenting more carefully. Summaries became more detailed. Fewer off-the-cuff recaps. Fewer casual paraphrases. Transparency had entered the room, and transparency is difficult to reverse. One afternoon, Daniel sent me a brief email. I regret that this situation has impacted your experience here. Not an admission, not an apology in explicit terms, but a recognition. I replied simply, I value accurate records. That was the only statement necessary. Too late to fix it doesn't mean destruction. It means the window for quiet containment has closed. If he had provided full context during the initial HR conversation, if he had shared the recordings transparently, this might have remained a coaching discussion. But once partial excerpts were used to shape a formal evaluation without disclosure, the integrity question became larger than either of us. You can't reassemble credibility after metadata is reviewed. You can adjust the language. You can refine policy. You can introduce training. But the awareness remains. From that point forward, no one in leadership would assume audio excerpts were neutral without verification. And Daniel knew it. The panic wasn't loud. It was procedural. Because once systems begin reviewing systems, individual intention becomes secondary to documented action. And documentation, this time, was complete. The final conversation didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened on a quiet Friday afternoon in Daniel's office. Sunlight angled across the carpet in long, pale strips. He had requested the meeting. Not HR, not legal, just him. When I walked in, he didn't show confidence. There was no steepled posture, no easy half smile. He gestured to the chair across from him. I wanted to speak without structure. Structure. For months, structure had been the issue. I sat down calmly, hands folded in my lap. He exhaled slowly. I underestimated how this would land with you. Not defensive, not aggressive, just factual. I nodded once. I never intended to distort anything, he continued. When I selected those clips, I was illustrating patterns. I wasn't trying to remove context. I listened carefully to the phrasing. Selected, illustrating, remove context. All accurate words. What matters, I said evenly, is that context was removed. He didn't interrupt. For a moment, the room felt unusually honest. Not because emotions were spilling over, but because neither of us was pretending anymore. I should have shared the full recordings with you, he admitted. That was the closest thing to an apology I would receive. And it was enough, not because it absolved him, but it acknowledged the structural flaw. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't recount every instance of reframing. I didn't catalogue grievances. There was no need. The archive had already spoken. I need my professional record to reflect full context, I said quietly. That's all. He nodded. It will. Silence settled between us. Not hostile, not warm, just resolved. This wasn't a victory scene. There was no triumphant energy, no emotional climax. It felt more like the closing of a ledger. What struck me most was how small the moment felt compared to the magnitude of what had shifted behind the scenes. For a year, Daniel had operated comfortably within narrative control. He had believed interpretation was leadership. Now he understood. Without anyone humiliating him, without public spectacle, that interpretation without transparency is fragile. As I stood to leave, he said something that lingered. You're different from what I thought. I paused at the door. How? I asked. He considered it. Quieter, but not passive. I gave a small, almost amused smile. I never was. And that was the truth. The confrontation didn't burn anything down. It clarified boundaries. After that meeting, our interactions became strictly professional. No more tone commentary. No more subtle reframing. If he summarized a call, he circulated the full transcript alongside it. Process had replaced assumption. I didn't feel anger walking back to my desk. I felt alignment. Because confrontation without heat isn't about dominating the other person. It's about standing inside your own standards so steadily that distortion can't coexist with it. And once that standard is visible, people adjust. Not because you forced them, because they can no longer afford not to. If you had met me before all of this, you would have seen the same woman you see now. Soft-spoken, measured, composed. What changed wasn't my volume, it was my threshold. Before, I believed that integrity, practiced consistently, would eventually defend itself. I thought being precise, ethical, and calm was enough protection in professional spaces. Now I understand something deeper. Integrity must be paired with documented clarity. Silence is only powerful when it is chosen, not when it is assumed of you. After the review concluded, my performance evaluation was formally amended. References to tone concerns were removed. A notation was added, clarifying that previous feedback had relied on partial audio excerpts without full contextual review. There was no public announcement, no dramatic correction, just a quiet adjustment in the record. And that was enough. Daniel remained in his role, though his approach shifted noticeably. Meetings became more structured, documentation more thorough, transparency less optional. We never became close, but we became clear, and clarity is far more stable than comfort. What surprised me most was not the external shift, it was the internal one. I stopped shrinking preemptively, not loudly, not definitely, simply by not trimming my sentences before they were spoken. If something required written confirmation, I said so directly. If documentation needed escalation, I explained why, fully. If a meeting summary omitted nuance, I corrected it, calmly and in writing, not as a reaction, as a standard. Colleagues began approaching me differently, not with sympathy, with respect. Because quiet dominance doesn't demand attention, it demonstrates consistency. I no longer felt the need to prove that I wasn't dramatic. That label had lost its power. When you've reviewed the full archive and know exactly what you said, self-doubt fades. There is a particular confidence that comes from surviving distortion, without becoming distorted yourself. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't humiliate anyone. I didn't expose private mistakes publicly. I relied on the process. And process, when used correctly, protects both sides from escalation. What I carry now is not bitterness, it's calibration. I understand how narratives are built, how perception is shaped, how easily context can be removed, and how firmly it can be restored. And perhaps most importantly, I understand myself differently. I'm not the reliable, quiet one. I am precise. I am observant. I am patient. And when necessary, I am immovable. Not because I raise my voice, but because I align my actions with structure and let the system do what it was designed to do when integrity is tested. The version of me who once believed documentation was optional has evolved. Now, documentation is a respect for myself, and that quiet shift has changed the way I walk into every room. Not louder, just undeniable. If you're waiting for a moment where everything explodes, where someone is publicly exposed or dramatically removed, this isn't that story. Nothing exploded. Nothing burned. What changed was quieter. The record was corrected. The archive was reviewed. The process was strengthened. And the narrative that once felt fragile became grounded in full context. I didn't win because someone else lost. I regained alignment because I refused to argue inside a distorted frame. There's a lesson here that took me years to understand. When someone controls the excerpt, they control the impression. When you secure the archive, you secure the truth. But this isn't just about legal process or corporate systems. It's about something more personal. How many times have you trimmed your own words before speaking? How often have you softened clarity to avoid being labeled difficult? How frequently have you trusted that being ethical would be enough protection on its own? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Quiet dominance isn't about intimidation. It's about refusing to let your character be summarized without context. It's about understanding that calm does not mean compliant, that patience does not mean powerless, that documentation is not aggression, it's self-respect. The most powerful moment in this entire experience wasn't when the inconsistencies were acknowledged. It was the night I realized I didn't need to shout to be protected. I just needed structure. And once I chose an action aligned with that structure, everything else unfolded predictably. If you've ever felt underestimated, if you've ever sensed your words were being reframed in rooms you weren't present in, if you've ever wondered whether staying quiet makes you safer or smaller, maybe the real question isn't whether to speak louder. Maybe it's this. Are you protecting the full context of who you are? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced a situation where the edited version of you didn't match the full story? And if so, what did you do next?